What I'm about to say could be sensitive to some, and I think most all of us have been affected by it, but I just want to preface that because I think it is significant for what we're going to be talking about tonight. In 2022 and 2023, 49,000 plus people committed suicide. There were an estimated 1.6 million suicide attempts, 3.8 million plans for suicide, and 13.2 million serious thoughts about suicide just in 2022 alone. This is the highest suicide rate since the Great Depression and World War II. And we can remember the history of those events in which people, maybe who had placed their entire hope in what they had, lost it all in a day. Others, as we move into the World War, we're looking at what the world was coming to and what they might have to be involved in. And yet, even in 2022 and 2023, we have not reached those levels of suicide rates. And yet, what we do find is that this is the highest it's been in 20 years. And as people look for what contributes to this kind of rate, depression and hopelessness are near the top, if not at the top. And when we think about that kind of contribution, the despair that can come in this life, in this world under this life under the sun, I think the Bible always gives us something to speak to these kinds of things that we face in this life, that we have to deal with in this life. And the book of Ecclesiastes speaks to the despair that some people can experience in the life under the sun. I've been working through Ecclesiastes over the last couple of months, and also Stephen and I have just begun working through Ecclesiastes with the young men in our young men's studies. And so Ecclesiastes has been on my mind. And then I specifically started thinking about what does Ecclesiastes say for beyond this life? And I think it does speak to that. It as one person has called the book of Ecclesiastes, is almost a cultural apologetic. And what they meant by that is when you look at life under the sun, it pushes you to see something beyond the sun, beyond heaven, that answers the great questions that we have in life. And not that we're just seeking for answers and making up solutions, but that there is something that has been revealed that you can't just find from an under the sun perspective. What we find is that utter hopelessness and despair comes from losing a view of the transcendent, losing a picture of God as the one who created all things and who is intimately involved in all things. So I want us to think about the life after the sun perspective that Ecclesiastes gives us. What we're going to do is look at three major ideas in Ecclesiastes that will help us to prepare for eternity. Number one, we're going to look at the fleeting nature of life. Number two, we're going to look at the eternal nature of the afterlife as presented in Ecclesiastes. And then we will look at how we can prepare for that day when we all must come face to face with God and what our eternal destiny will be. So if you're following along in your Bible, please turn to Ecclesiastes, and we're going to be spending time there throughout our study. In fact, most of the passages that we read tonight will be from Ecclesiastes, though we will have some cross-references here and there. Let's begin with the fleeting nature of life, the fleeting nature of life. And we're going to begin with a word that is very significant in the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's the word hebel in Hebrew. This word is used 73 times in the Old Testament, and 38 of those times occur just in the little book of Ecclesiastes. So in 12 chapters, we have over half of the occurrences of the word hebel. And that word hebel is usually translated vanity, sometimes meaninglessness or futility, or maybe even brevity. In fact, we see that kind of basic idea in Job 7 and verse 16, where this word hebel is translated as breath. And so it's just a breath, it's just a vapor is kind of the idea. But that emptiness of mist, if you will, came to be used of other things as well. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse number 21, it's in our English Bibles usually translated their idols, but it's literally their vain things, They're empty things. And that's our word, hebel. They're vanities, if you will. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 2, we're working our way through the Pentateuch. This is actually the name of Cain's brother. We say Abel, but it is Hebel. That maybe speaks a little bit to the characteristic of Abel, that his life was short, and from a worldly perspective, it was fairly empty. And yet we see that even in that Hebel, that Abel, there was something far beyond this life that gave purpose to his life and gave meaning to his life. We'll come back to that a little bit later. In Exodus chapter 26 and verse 33, we don't find the word Hebel, but we find a construction that's going to work into our view of Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 2, where it talks about the most holy place. Now, if your translation says most holy place, that's a good translation, but literally it is holy of holies. And the reason our English Bibles say most holy place is that's how they would take that one word, holy, and make it into a most holy. This is the holy of holies. Gives an exclamation point, if you will. This is the most holy place. We find something very similar to that with our use of Hebel in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 2. Look with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So we've looked at this word Hebel and seen how it means breath, it means vain, it means empty, it means short. And then we saw how when you say one word of the plural form of that, it can mean the uttermost. Now we have that applied to Hebel. The utter meaninglessness of life is in essence what the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us. And so when he looks at this world, when he looks at this life from the perspective that he starts with in chapter 1, he's saying, this is the uttermost meaninglessness and fleetingness of life. Now that sounds like despair to me. That sounds like hopelessness to me. In fact, he's even going to follow that up by saying, what is the advantage? He's going to talk about the cyclical nature of life. And so when we see this word vanity in Ecclesiastes, he's applying this concept of something that is short, something that is brief, but also something that could be empty and seemingly purposeless. And now he's saying that's what life is like under the sun. And we wonder, how in the world did that get into the Bible? And what we're going to find is that what he is doing is he is using this perspective in order to point to something beyond this life. I think what he is doing with this word is that he is blending the notions of fleeting and meaningless in order to give us a under the sun perspective. We're not going to read verses 3 through 11, but on your own time you can look at that passage where he talks about what is the advantage, because everything seems to just be cyclical. It's short, it's vain, and it just keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. A lot of times, the only time we will look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1 is to say, look, here's some scientific foreknowledge that there is this rain cycle, and it goes down and it comes back up. They already understood the rain cycle. What he's saying is, I see that cyclical nature, and it seems like it's empty. It just keeps on repeating itself. That's the perspective that he is giving. Look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Look at, as he views this life, he says, I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. Notice the repetition there. He's looking at all the oppression. He says, there's no one. There's no one there to comfort. So what does he do? I congratulated, or that word could be translated commended. I commended the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is a result of rivalry between the man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. So as you look at this perspective, what we find is that there is this oppression that seems empty to him. Why is the world like this? It's repetitive, it's empty, and it seems like it's oppression for everyone who exists here. It's vain and striving after the wind. Look at chapter 6 and verse 12. Chapter 6 and verse 12. Even as he talks about that which seems to be good, he applies this word vain. He says, "For who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile," that's the same word, vain, vanity, vain life, "he will spend them like a shadow, for who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun?" Now, here as we're kind of bringing these ideas together, what I want us to get is that he is constantly bringing in this phrase, under the sun. He'll sometimes use the equivalent, under heaven. And what he says is, an under the sun perspective, it seems like it's pretty fleeting and meaningless life. And yet, he says there is something good here in the midst of this vanity. And there is someone here that points to that points to a good person who is providing that to us, and that it can't just be under the sun that we get that. If we look at this world and we nix God from the picture, we are going to be left with what seems empty, meaningless, fleeting, and that there is no purpose. I think that's why we are seeing an uptick in suicides and depression and despair in this world, is because for a long time, but let's just say for several decades, we've been telling people God is dead. There is no God. And what are you left with? You're left with an under the sun perspective. Now, Ecclesiastes is going to bring us out of the melancholy. It's going to bring us out of the purposelessness. But he is saying this is what it looks like when you don't have God in the picture. And so what does Solomon do? He urges his readers, or maybe his listeners originally, to appreciate the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, and the reality of judgment and eternity. We're going to spend some time developing each of these ideas in the next 2 points, but you read Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, and what do you find? It is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Why? Because in the house of mourning is where every man will be. He says, we have got to get a perspective. Yes, life is fleeting. Yes, it ends in the house of mourning, and we need to take some things to heart. As he brings his book to a close in chapter 12, as he's speaking to the young man, seemingly the one who he is trying to teach, he is the wise man, wise teacher, wise speaker to the assembly. He is saying, you young man, just like he spoke to the young man in Proverbs, now he is speaking to the young man in Ecclesiastes and says, there's going to be a time when all the prime of youth is spent, and you are getting older and weaker, and where will you be when you don't have it all anymore? Or in chapter 2, verses 12 through 23, it says, not only will you be spent physically, but it might be that you seek wisdom and as intellect as the answer. He says, you're still going to be under the sun. And in a lot of ways, the wisdom that you would gain, even this good wisdom that Solomon had, is purely practical and under the sun if you untether it from God. And so a life untethered from God, physically, mentally, is going to wind up in despair. It's going to wind up in purposelessness. And so what does he do? He uses, for the most part, this picture of a fleeting life in order to try to jar people who are under the sun. And then once he gets their attention throughout this book, what he's going to do is sprinkle in pictures of the afterlife and say, there might be something more here. Now, I believe that Solomon had at least some concept of the afterlife, probably very limited, and we're going to talk about that. But at the same time, these questions are not because Solomon just says, this is all there is. It's because he sees there's something beyond, and he wants to point people to it. And so as we think about the afterlife, I suggest that up until modern times, everyone has accepted some form of afterlife. They were mistaken in a lot of what that looked like practically. You think about probably the ones who gave the most time and effort to the afterlife were the Egyptians. And you look at the monuments that they had to an afterlife. They believed in an afterlife. They were wrong to think that they could carry all that with them and that it would represent something on the other side. And yet, they had this concept. We see all the nations around Israel had this concept. We see the Greeks and the Romans in the New Testament had this concept. Everyone could feel the pull of something beyond the under the sun life. And it's not until modern times that people have said, no, there is no God, and there is nothing beyond this life. And so we are maybe moving into unprecedented areas by saying that there is no afterlife. But what we find in the Bible is that it doesn't just affirm that everyone is right. What it actually says is God sprinkled this into man before man was even thinking some of these false thoughts about the afterlife. You see, the Old Testament description of the afterlife is limited but not absent, and that Ecclesiastes winds up matching it in several ways. Probably one of the most familiar texts is Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse number 11. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Now, we could spend an entire sermon just on this verse, but the point I want to make is that this concept of setting eternity in our heart, what he's saying is that creates an alienation here under the sun. That we sense that there is something beyond. Now, he's going to suggest that God is kind of withholding certain things at this point. He's trying to make people yearn for something beyond. At least that's how I take this. I know there's differences of interpretation, but there is this eternity that has been set in the heart of man. Look at what he says in chapter 7 and verse 14. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be happy, but in the day of adversity, consider, God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. Now, to set kind of a precedent here in chapter 3 and also in chapter 7, I think what he's working toward is this idea of there is limitation in the knowledge at this point. That God, as some people have said, the Old Testament is somewhat of the moonlight of revelation, and that when we come to Jesus, we get the sunlight of revelation. And yet what we find is that God is trying to produce a fear within people, a hesitancy, so that they will respect that he is intimately involved with this creation. That he started it, but he's also going to finish it, and that we are looking for something beyond. And so he'll ask rhetorical questions. Who knows? Who knows? The implication is only God knows. And so we must be careful as we come before him, and we must listen to what he has to say. Look in chapter 9. Chapter 9, Ecclesiastes 9, beginning in verse 2. He says, "It is the same for all. There is one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and for the unclean, for the man who offers a sacrifice, and for the one who does not sacrifice. As the good man is, so is the sinner. As the swearer is, so is the one who is afraid to swear. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that there is one fate for all men. Furthermore, the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil and insanity in their hearts throughout their lives. Afterward they go to the dead. For whoever is joined with all the living, there is hope.
Surely a live dog is better than a dead lion, for the living know they will die, but the dead do not know anything, nor do they any longer have a reward, for their memory is forgotten. Indeed, their love, their hate, their zeal have already perished, and they will no longer have a share in all that is done under the sun. Drop down to verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. Now, working backwards for just a moment, notice Sheol is the Hebrew word for the underworld, or sometimes for the grave, but for the underworld. And so the picture is not that he's saying there is no life after death. The knowledge that he is focusing on is the knowledge that you will die. Did you notice that? Back in verse number 5, he says, what's the knowledge that the dead no longer have? That is the knowledge, the living know that they will die. So what he's doing is presenting a hope for something that comes beyond, because once this life is over, once you've reached Sheol, there is no more knowledge that I will die and I need to do something about it. And so the picture here is not that the writer of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, is saying, there's nothing after life, there's no knowledge, there's no personality once you die. What he's saying is, you have missed your opportunity to be ready for the end. The living know they will die. And so the picture here is that, yes, there is something. There is Sheol. There is a place to which we are going. The question is, do we know now that we will die, and are we preparing for eternity that is to come? Look in chapter 12 and verse number 7. Chapter 12 and verse number 7. I'll begin in verse number 6. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed, the pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Some people read the book of Ecclesiastes, and they've got a totally skeptical and pessimistic view, and what they think Solomon is saying is, once you're dead, you're dead. That's all there is. Your spirit has gone back to God. He's reclaimed it, and you cease to exist. You cease to have knowledge. I think that's not a fair reading of Ecclesiastes in its entire context. What he seems to be saying here is that you are going to return to dust. Just like the animal, just like the fool, whether you are wise or whether you are righteous, your body is going to return to the dust. But your spirit is going to return to God. Now, we don't have a very clear picture of resurrection here. I think that's only limited in the Old Testament and then ultimately comes to fruition in the New Testament. But there is this picture that your spirit is going to meet God. And are you prepared to meet the Lord? It's not just Ecclesiastes, but the rest of the Old Testament has this picture of there is something with Sheol. There is something beyond the grave. You can read that and how the New Testament applies it in Psalm 16 and verse 10, that you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. How does the New Testament interpret that? You will not abandon my soul to Hades. What is Hades? That is the underworld, just like it was for the Hebrews. And what does that look like for Jesus? That he didn't just die on the cross. His life continued after the cross. His spirit went to God, and then in resurrection, it was returned to a body. And so we have here this picture of there is going to be something beyond. Look at Psalm 49. Psalm 49. This is probably one of the clearer pictures in the Old Testament, that Sheol is not just this end of existence. In Psalm 49, beginning in verse number 13, says, "This is the way of those who are foolish, and of those after them who approve their words. As sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning. And their form shall be for Sheol to consume, so that they have no habitation. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me." And in very limited and kind of poetic ways, he is saying, Sheol, but there is going to be an authority for those who are the upright. And so we have a picture of there is something beyond this life. And as we read the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 11 that even the patriarchs were not just looking for the physical land, and that they knew there was something after death, that there was a heavenly city that God had prepared for them. And so we should not say the Old Testament did not picture an afterlife. And we should not even say that the Old Testament did not have a picture of resurrection. But in Ecclesiastes, he is saying, yes, we're all going to die, but death is not the end. This is even further confirmed by the fact that Solomon discusses final judgment. Final judgment in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 16 through 21. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 16 through 21. He says, "Furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there." Pause there for just a moment. Keep in mind how this repetition of time has been happening in chapter 3. You've got a time for everything, a time for every activity under the sun. But then you have a time for this, a time for that. And then what do we see? Verse 11, he has made everything appropriate in its time and set eternity in their hearts. And now he says there's going to be judgment. For a time for every matter and for every deed is there. We'll come back to that word in just a moment. But look at what he says there in verse number 18. "I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are only beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better than that a man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him?" Now, a couple of things that I think are significant here as we're trying to see the afterlife. Reading through, there are some things in which he's saying, look, it's the same for every living creature. We're all going to go to dust. But he is picturing that there might be something more for man. Notice the judgment where he says in verse 17, "A time for every place and for every deed is there." Where is the there? Well, the there could be Sheol, which implies that there is a distinction being made between the spirits. The there could be the judgment that God is going to offer, but there is a place for the one after death. Yes, there is injustice here, but there is going to be justice there. God is going to judge. And furthermore, as he's asking those questions, who knows? Who knows? The implication is, under the sun, no one here knows what's going to be afterward. But there might just be someone, as we read a little bit further in Ecclesiastes, who does know. Maybe the one who's going to judge there. And so the picture of judgment implies there's going to be a reckoning at the end of this life. In chapter 8, verses 10 through 13, he talks about the God-fearer. Things will be well for him. Well, how is it going to be well for him? Because in the context of Ecclesiastes, he says the righteous, the God-fearer, might suffer in this life, might be oppressed in this life. So where's the wellness going to come from? It's going to have to come after the oppression that is in this life. In chapter 11, verses 9 through 10, he talks to the young man, says, you can be doing all these things. Just realize God is going to bring these into judgment. Well, when's that going to happen? You got to keep it in its context, because then he goes right into talking about how that you're going to grow old and you're going to die. So where's the judgment going to happen? Not in this life, necessarily. There is going to be a final reckoning. And even at the most famous verses in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. From his under the sun perspective, he has said, I'm not seeing any of that judgment necessarily happening here. Now, he kind of hints that maybe the authorities, like the king, are supposed to do justice, and maybe they're the ones who are going to provide some judgment. But then he goes along and says, but even some kings are oppressive, and they cause problems for people. So where's the judgment going to happen for the God-fearer? It's going to be after this life. Under the sun is not all there is. Death is not the end. This life is not the end. And so what does he do? He transitions into this concept of a reward. There is a reward, and normally he's talking about a present reward. I like to translate this word as allotment. Sometimes it will even be translated as his lot. And that kind of sounds somewhat negative to say this is his lot in life. But if you say this is his allotment from God, he is saying there is something that can be enjoyed in this life because there is something that's going to follow it after this life. And so in chapter 3 and verse 17, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 17, I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous and the wicked man for a time for every matter, and every deed is there. There is something that's going to come. Now, look at verse 22. I have seen that nothing is better than that a man should be happy in his activities, for this is his lot. This is his allotment. This is his reward. He's saying, under the sun, since there's going to be despair and injustice and seeming meaninglessness, he says, God has given something to the God-fearer, that you can enjoy something now, whether it be little or whether it be much, because you know that there is something there, that there is going to be a final reckoning there. Now, he caveats this somewhat in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. He says, now the person who's storing up all the goods and forgetting about God, he says he can't carry that in his hand. He's not going to carry it with him. And yet, interestingly enough, you have in verses 18 through 20, seemingly the wealthy one who has been empowered by God to remember that this has come from God. He says he can receive it. That's actually the same word. He can carry it in his hand. And so the greedy one is not going to be able to carry this in his hand, but the one who remembers God is going to be able to carry this in his hand. He can remember where this has come from. And so you put these two concepts together. He says, if we are looking at this life purely from an under the sun perspective, it seems empty. It seems meaningless. But when you have a God who is going to have a final reckoning and who is giving us good gifts here and now to remember who he is and to be cautious in our approach to him, be reverent of him so that we obey his commandments, he says there's going to be something that is beyond this life that is good for the people of God. In Ecclesiastes, we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but I'd encourage you to read it and watch for all the times he talks about that which is good or that which is better, because he is repeating this word to say, what is good? And he says, this is what is good. To recognize that God has given you these things, the gift, the allotment, the reward. He uses various words to say, if you can remember the source and you can see the end through the lens of faith, then you will be prepared for the next life. And so that's what I want us to finish up with tonight, is that the idea of Ecclesiastes is not just, woe is me, everything is terrible, there's nothing good here. He says, it's time to get ready because eternity is coming. And so what does that look like? Well, you have all the points there. What does that look like? Number one, it looks like fearing God. If we know eternity is coming, the message of Ecclesiastes is fear God. The work of God is meant to lead to the fear of God. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. That we should be careful in our approach to God. We should not just be hasty to enter before him if we're not ready. And if we make a vow, we definitely need to pay that. We need to remember who we are and who he is. And I think it is when we abandon a notion of God, abandon a notion of the afterlife, that we get much more cavalier in our life. That we think we can do just anything we want because this is all there is. Ecclesiastes is trying to stop that kind of mentality by presenting a picture of God, that he is going to handle these things. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of man. Fear God, but also pursue wisdom. If we want to be ready for the next life, I suggest that he says we need to pursue wisdom. Now, he is going to place limitations on that. He is going to say that wisdom is not going to get you all the way there. That if you are just using practical, daily, everyday wisdom, that's not going to necessarily get you ready for eternity, but it does do a lot to help you succeed in this life. And if you can put that in a context of divine wisdom that has been revealed, then you're going to live a much better life here. Look in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, he says in verse 11, wisdom along with an inheritance is good, and an advantage to those who see the sun. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Consider the work of God. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. He is saying wisdom is something important. You want to be ready in this life? If you completely abandon wisdom, you're going to be living a life that is not God-honoring. But just realize the limitations on wisdom. You need something transcendent. You need something eternal to add to your perspective in order for wisdom to become effective in life. Number 3, now this might sound strange, but to prepare for eternity, we do need to enjoy life here. And I think that's a major theme in Ecclesiastes. We need to enjoy life here. Sometimes when we think judgment, we think, I just need to become a stoic. I just need to abandon all pleasures. I need to avoid anything that could lead me into temptation. I don't think we need to be brought into temptation. We want to avoid temptation. But anything can become a temptation. And so the question is, are we going to enjoy life the way God expects us to? Or are we going to forget about God and try to enjoy it without him? And the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, you should enjoy life now because God has given this to you. What does that do? It helps you to remember that God is involved in your life now so that you're ready to meet him at the end of this life. What does Paul say in Romans chapter 2? He says, the kindness of God leads you to repentance. You see, it's not just the evil and the suffering that we endure in this life that causes us to repent. It's also the good that God gives to our life that should lead us to repentance. But also when we see the hand of the one who is giving this to us, that we recognize what is good, the allotment, the reward that he gives us in this life, we can enjoy it and we can be ready saying, I want to meet the one who has given this to me. And to do that, I have to be ready for the end of this life. Let's just go to, let's use Ecclesiastes 3, verses 12 and 13. Ecclesiastes 12 and 13, we've been reading around it. But he says, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. When you enjoy this life and you are thankful to the God who gave it, you are preparing for eternity because he is going to heap all manner of more reward upon us in eternity. And so, as Doy Moyer said, God gives us pictures of heaven and pictures of hell in this world so that we make the right choice. And so, when we can see the good that is in this life that comes from the hand of God, that should cause us to yearn for that eternal good that he wants to provide for us. But we do need to anticipate judgment. Especially when we're young, we may think, I've got all the time in the world. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, if you want to be prepared for judgment, then you need to anticipate that it is coming. Even in youth, we need to anticipate that judgment is coming. Look in Ecclesiastes 11 in verse 9. Notice how he pairs these ideas of enjoying this life, but keeping it within perspective. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and desires of your eyes, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. And again, in chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man, for God will bring everything into judgment. He says, yes, fear God, worship God. Yes, enjoy life, whether it be the good things that come into your life, the physical things, whether it just be the enjoyment of you with the companionship of you and your wife. He'll say in another place, he says, if you can keep all that in perspective and know that judgment is coming, then you're going to be ready. Because you're going to treat those things not as the end in and of themselves, but they are just the precursor to something far better. And we can also see that turning against God now is a precursor of something far worse that is coming as well. So anticipate judgment. And then I want to add one thing to Ecclesiastes that Solomon was not given a revelation of, but I think we have. We've seen in Luke 11. Let's read very quickly Luke 11, 29 through 36. And that is, if you want to be ready for the judgment, ready for eternity, then you need to follow the one who is providing something far better and greater than what Solomon does. Solomon gives us great wisdom in how to prepare for eternity. Jesus gives us that much better. In Luke 11, verses 29 through 36, it says, as the crowds were increasing, he began to say, this generation is a wicked generation. It seeks for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. The queen of the south will rise up with the men of this generation at the judgment and condemn them, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it away in a cellar, nor under a basket, but on the lampstand, so that those who enter may see the light. The eye of the lamp is your body. The eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is clear, your whole body also will be full of light. And when it is bad, your body also will be full of darkness. Then watch out what the light in you is not darkness. If therefore your whole body is full of light, with no dark part in it, it will be wholly illumined as when the lamp illumines you with its rays. There's 3 points I want to leave you with from this text. Notice he doesn't say someone better than Solomon or someone better than Jonah is here. He says something greater than Solomon and something greater than Jonah is here. That could be talking about Jesus, but I tend to think he's saying, look at the wisdom of Solomon. Something greater than that wisdom has been shown. And look at the preaching of Jonah. That did great things, but something greater than the preaching of Jonah is here. What is it? It's the revelation that Jesus has died, was buried, and is resurrected. That sign will be given. He says furthermore that the revelation, the full revelation, the ultimate wisdom, the ultimate preaching is being done through Jesus Christ. And what that can lead to is an inward renewal that prepares us for eternity. Resurrection, revelation, renewal, all possible in Jesus Christ. And so the question is, if Solomon can get us a couple of steps along the path, will we see what he was pointing to? The preaching of Jesus, the wisdom of Jesus, and follow him the rest of the way. Because if we want to be prepared for eternity, we need to be prepared to meet Jesus. And Acts chapter 17 says, Jesus, by resurrection, has been proven to be the judge. That judgment is coming. The final reckoning is coming. And you may think that you are years and years away from it. I don't know. I can't tell the future. As Ecclesiastes says, no man knows what will come after him. But there is a God who has told us that there is one thing that is going to happen to all people, and we're all going to come into judgment. Will we walk the path of death and resurrection in Jesus Christ so that we are prepared for the final judgment, so that we can be with him forever and enjoy the eternal good and not just the temporary good of this life? If you want to come out of the despair that comes from a purely under the sun perspective, look past the sun and look to the Messiah, because he can take you into eternity with him. And if you're ready to make that commitment to the Lord tonight, why don't you let us know how we can help as we stand and as we sing.